Hello, and welcome to episode 407 of the Crate and Crowbar. It is the 18th of October, 2022. My name is Chris Thurston, and joining me this evening is Marsh Davis.
Hello, Chris. Hello.
Hello, Marsh. Marsh, I think I noticed something. So it's been a little while since I've been on the podcast. And obviously apologies that we missed last week due to associated aches and pains and ailments and agonies. I've noticed something. It feels like we've had a little bit of a kind of a sticky phase in the names of the podcasts.
Oh, really?
Because the last time I was on the podcast, the title was Too Tight or Roborous, which is like slightly sphincterish, but not 100% committed. And then next was Sticky Goop, the Safest Fireball, and then A Morning Constitutional on Fart Planet, and then, slightly less specifically, Nutsy Bolts Armageddon Machine. Now, to me, this whole thing, and maybe I am leading the witness here, but it walks in a kind of biomechanical, farty, squelchy, flatulent direction, which I think is going to be strikingly relevant to our episode today. The reason I say all of this is to establish at the top of the dial that this isn't going to get better anytime soon. But I would like to ask you before, because I feel like I very strongly suspect that today we're exclusively going to be talking about games where everyone smells awful. And so I wanted to ask you, would you say you've ever been to Paradise Marsh?
Well, yes. I thought you were going to segue into a completely different game. So I
pulled a fast one on.
I was like trying to come up with puns for foreskins and flaps and all kinds of gribbly things. And you've forced me to take my segue and dump it in a delightful bogland instead.
Tell me about the delightful bogland.
Paradise Marsh. That's the name of the game, Paradise Marsh, almost as though it was made for me. Although I suspect it was probably made for Pip because it's a game about collecting bugs, and she likes to do that. It's a very jolly little thing, It's about wandering this wetland, finding insects and other wildlife, and doing so in order to restore the constellations to the night sky, which have just plunged out of the sky for no apparent reason. And you walk around this lovely wetland, which is, I think, possibly infinite and generated as you walk. It's like trees literally sort of pop out of the ground as you move towards the horizon line. And when you sort of do that, you kind of listen out for frogs and toads and fun beetles, and then you sneak up on them and you net them. And each creature represents a star from one of those missing constellations. And when you've got enough, you go to these obelisks, which shoots the stars back into the sky, and then you can have a lovely chat with the constellations, each of whom has their own personalities, which are quite nicely written. The cricket is this conspiracy theorist boomer. The snail is a sort of miserable nihilist. The dragonfly is Brian Blessed, as far as I can tell, and the spider is French. And once you've done with their patter, you can sort of link up the stars by redrawing the constellations, like linking up the stars, and then they chatter some more. And there's sort of like a bit of a challenge to it, in that some creatures require some basic tactics to snag, like you need to stand still for the spider to return to its position before you can get it. And some of them might require you to eat like certain found items in the environment to gain a temporary ability. There are some mushrooms which just make you trip. And some, as per the song, make you taller, which is useful to get things which require you to be tall. And there are also messages and bottles that you can find, which kind of, I guess, tell some sort of story. And there's birds which recite poetry to you, some of which is actually quite good. It's a surprising game. It's really not set out to tax you in any way, and it doesn't even particularly matter which direction you go in, because as far as I can tell, the way that the procedural generation works, the game is just like always putting the stuff you need in front of you to stumble upon. Um, but I just found it really delightful. It was a very pleasurable thing to tool around in a week when those agues and aches, as you referred to earlier, were upon my mind. It was a soothing balm, Chris, made out of
Mm.
bog water.
So
It's
this
good.
seems like the perfect balm for you.
Indeed.
Did you complete it?
No, I haven't yet because I got distracted by a game we've both played instead, which is um,
The opposite.
the opposite of that game. Yeah, although I suspect both the bog and it may have a certain kind of odorous quality. We've both been playing Scorn,
Mm.
which is a horrible game inspired by the paintings of H.R. Geiger.
Very much so. Yeah. I don't know. Would it be alright if I explained what it was like to go in knowing nothing about this game?
Oh
I don't
yeah.
know if you had. Did you know anything about it before you played it?
Um, I knew that it tentatively occupied a particular genre, but actually, I think that's not true. So,
Right. So
but go on, tell me what you knew of it.
I think we will. I think we'll probably say the same thing then. I knew all I knew was it kind of looked pretty gnarly, and listener it is. And but I fully expected. I actually put off playing it a little bit because I had so much to do, and I had a bit of a kind of stressful run of days end of last week into the weekend, and so I was like, this isn't the time for grotesque horror. Basically, had to be in the right mood for it because incorrectly, I assumed this was going to be a first-person horror game. Maybe not totally incorrectly, but like, I was trying to figure out exactly what I mean when I talk about like, first-person immersive horror in the manner of like Amnesia or Soma or something like that. But what I realized I really mean, and it is sort of this, is a game where bad things happen to your hands, because that's a genre, right?
Yeah.
It's first person horror games where your character you principally interact with the world through your character's slightly grippy, grabby, slappy meat hands as they get stung by bees or get a pen goes through their hand or like, because games can't really feed back to you that the thing that you're touching is horrid with any other way other than bad things happening to your hands. I think obviously the absolute apex of this genre is the best thing in Resident Evil 7 that happens.
Yeah.
Um, in the bad hands genre, maybe bad hands is the best way to describe this genre. There's a common twist that is used quite frequently in the bad hands genre. I would also specify that BioShock, the first one, I think is an early pioneer of this. Because that's very much a game about bad things happening to your hands. It's just because it's also the other 50% of it is a shooter. That was, because it was 2007 or 2008 or whatever it was, and we were young and naive then. We assumed everything had to be a gun. So in that game, every bad thing that happens to your hands turns your hands into a different kind of gun. But the connective tissue here is that the other thing that happens in a bad hands game is the chest burster from Alien, because that's the other thing they can do, where your character looks down suddenly and something's sticking out of their chest, because that's the only other violence first person games can really do. So BioShock had one of them famously in its trailer. That hasn't been the case yet, but basically I think I've figured it out that there's a whole span of first person horror games where two things can happen. Something goes through your hand or breaks your fingers, or someone, like, I don't know, puts a machete in you from behind and you look back and your character's vision goes really blurry, and then 2 minutes later you're fine.
Have you finished Scorn?
No.
I see. Okay.
No, and so I want to caveat by saying that I'm very, very early in Scorn because I haven't had a ton of time to play it. But I was really surprised to discover, thinking it was going to be that, an early doors, thinking it pretty much is this because it's pretty gnarly, and then discovering, to my absolute surprise, that it's fucking Mist.
Yeah. I mean, well, or is it, Chris?
Well, so far it's missed. I understand it's going to change. I only understand that because of like a slight UI bug. I wasn't sure if I didn't understand the controls, and I opened the menu, and the controls, as far as I can tell, describe a completely different game to the one that I'm playing. Because I opened the menu and it was like, equip underslung grenade launcher, use fireball, or whatever the fuck it was saying. Like,
Yeah. Oh, interestingly, it doesn't necessarily tell you what those buttons are well after those mechanics have been introduced. Uh,
hmm.
I found. So I only discovered that some mechanics existed because I had looked at the control scheme, and I was like, "Oh, what?" Then I pressed R or whatever. I was like, "Oh." But yeah, it's interesting. It is. I mean, I'd actually heard this the other way around, where I'd heard tentatively somebody describe it as a first-person puzzle game, but I think it's actually not, or it is. It's sort of very begrudgingly a puzzle game, in the same way that it's also begrudgingly later a combat game. And I think it's it doesn't really want to be either of those things because it wants to lean more towards this experiential thing rather than like an expressly ludic challenge, which would
Hmm.
pull you away from what it's trying to do, which is to draw you through these vast, beautiful and horrible environments inspired by H.R. Geiger. um, and like for better and worse, I think it sort of straddles that genre line. Sure, I should probably say who Geiger is. I mean, I'd be surprised if people weren't familiar with his oeuvre, um, which is
Indeed, his Earth.
indeed. I mean, he designed the Alien, famously from Alien, but he had a long career before that, in which he was fascinated by many of the things that the Alien typifies, which is sort of this meeting of organic and industrial, the body, obsession with sex, both as a really mucky and horrific biological process, and also as an erotic impulse. And so his art is filled with these sort of imagined landscapes of swelling organic machinery and ribbed, glistening structures that are somewhat redolent of penises, integrated with creatures that are, in seeming various states of copulation or consumption or evolution. And Scorn is like very faithfully set within those landscapes in a way which is very. I think Geiger would have approved.
Yeah.
And you play this unknown protagonist um, who at the start of the game peels himself, not totally human by the looks of him, who peels himself from this sort of ichor that has encased him, and he sets about an unknown purpose, which you can only partially hope to understand as you sort of you further his aims in the world. And I think you are sort of a creature of this world, and so there is this interesting and sometimes very frustrating disconnect between what you know as a player and what your character presumably intuits of the environment and what his intentions are within it. But for the most part, the only thing that is clear to the player from their perspective is that to reach new environments, one must go on, and going on sometimes like involves an Eggman and then with a giant ice cream scoop and then sticking into a glistening to open a door.
Huh. I solved that differently.
Did you? Well, I see. Because that environment, there are two mechanisms that you can interact with, but you don't get a choice to go back once you've
Right.
made a
Yeah.
choice.
Let's
I
return to that. Sorry,
regretted.
put a pin in that. Put a pin in
Mhm.
that. And yeah.
Sorry, like I really admire a lot of things about this game. Um, I like the evocation of Geiger's of his art and themes. I think that's pretty unimpeachable. Actually, I think it's probably one of the kind of the best and most affectionate evocations of an artist's idiom in a game. And I think it would have been easy enough to create a game which was sort of like a greatest hits of his gribbly penile statues and drippy woo woo cities. But I feel like it really engages with the meaning of that in a way
Yeah.
which it probably didn't need to. And I think in a lot of the interactions that you go through and the way that the landscape is alive and what is revealed to be your ultimate intention within that place, it is explicitly about a lot of the things that Geiger was preoccupied with, like creation and procreation in all of its horror. There's sort of like a escalation towards celestial horror territory that sort of implants ideas of transcendence within this sort of terrible and brutal cycle of exploitative body horror. I think that is all really clever stuff, and I think that's fantastic, and that's the reason to play the game. I would say, however, it doesn't jibe very well often with the missed stuff, like
Mm.
the grosser mechanical stuff from which the base interactions of the game are wrought. I've alluded to the puzzles previously, and that there's obviously this tension between wanting to present the game which is true to the larger themes and aesthetic vision of Geiger, and then there's something which, probably focus groups have decided needs to have explicit puzzle mechanics. And it sort of splits the difference in a way which makes some of those puzzles quite bad from a puzzle design perspective. How did you find them?
I am very early in the game, but like the shock for me was sort of like exploring, because the environments really are extraordinary. I think it looks amazing, and I think it's a commitment to not having a UI. While I'll say this: the commitment to not having a UI is when the stars align and you can just intuit what the mechanic is going to be. I think it works remarkably well. When you are slightly frustrated, it's annoying. And then the middle ground between those things is when things go from feeling very analog and organic, which is very appropriate to the subject matter, to suddenly you're doing a fucking slidey tile puzzle, but you're doing it in Dr. H.R. Geiger's House of Sphincters. Like, that's like, and every time you move a tile,
there's the title for the episode.
and every time you move a tile, it goes. Like, that's, you know what I mean? As your character slides his fingers in and out of a big glove. There are so many worse words I could have used in that last sentence. You should see my fucking notes. I mean, I've really enjoyed writing words that this game has made me think, but I cannot say them. But the puzzliness of those puzzles is quite jarring. However, that was an interesting transition. Like, I don't know. The puzzle I'm thinking about is really the first puzzle in the game, and I don't know where to put a spoiler barrier on this, really. It's interesting that it can be solved a few different ways, because what I was going to say is it's a really interesting transition from scoping out what you feel like the puzzle's going to be, which is this process of exploring a big environment, seeing what you can interact with, and intuiting the intent of the designer, which is like a two-part thing. One part is, how does this puzzle game fit together? And in my case, was also discovering that it was a puzzle game. And then, and the other is, well, this mechanic is encouraging me to take in this place, and this place is genuinely kind of pretty extraordinary and gross and interesting. And then realizing pretty much what it was, I had a really satisfying experience of that puzzle in a weird way, where I realized what it was that I would need to do when I realized what was blocking me from leaving that area. Because, as you say, your onward progress is your only goal, really. And then I intuited what I would need to find before I had any idea where to find it, or that it was even in the level. And so I went and found it, little egg. And then I did an extremely strangely sort of didactic and digital feeling slidey puzzle.
Yeah.
And then I entered a completely different domain of very, like, honestly, the sequence after that, which I don't want to spoil really, but like in terms of how it's animated and the sound design and the way the physical design of the props used encourages you to have a sort of empathetic relationship with the first other moving creature you've met in the environment. It's fucking grotesque. It's genuinely one of the gnarliest things I think I've seen in a game. Like, I am actually like not amazing. I love horror, but I'm not amazing with jump scares. And so a lot of horror games don't work for me a huge amount. I think I probably said this in the podcast before over the years. I must have done. Because for me, and this is true of horror movies as well, jump scares tend to take me out of an experience rather than keep me in it. Because they make me acutely aware of myself as either a viewer or a player rather than the character in their experience. It's like, it's very, occasionally jump scares can work for me, but like often I find it's a bit like one of those really dodgy, like mostly now defunct cinema 4D experiences where, like, I don't know, someone mists you with a little spray of water while you're watching Jaws or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I just don't find it immersive because you've just spooked me, right? And I've just gone, huh! And that's not that hard to do, right? Like that happens if like the doorbell rings. So that's, you know what I mean? Like, and it is that kind of response. It feels like an intrusion out of the media into my life in a way that doesn't actually like help me enjoy it. But I love the atmosphere of horror, and that sequence at the beginning of Scorn, I thought was just fucking brilliant. And now, after what you just said, realizing that one thing that I realized is I solved it in a way that was gross and very weird, and encouraged and crucially forced me to intuit game systems that I assumed had to exist for me to be able to solve the puzzle, rather than wait for a button prompt, which feels great.
Yeah, I think so. That's definitely the best puzzle in the game, which is a bit of a disappointment.
Oh shit! Oh well.
But but like as you say, like there's the you kind of proceed logically as a player using your understanding what is interactable and a mechanic in kind of the gross terms of what the game is in an interactive way. But then the solution for that, which you're led to through your actions as a player, is then characterized within the world in a way which is far more horrible and macabre than you could have ever realized,
Yeah.
but which your character presumably would anticipate. And so at that point, I was like, oh, I'm not a good person. Like I'm one of these horrible things that is horrible because of the environment it's in, and I'm such a part of this world that I am inured to the terrible cycles of brutality and exploitation that are occurring there. I yeah.
I
I mean,
saw it
the thing
slightly
is, the weird thing is,
differently.
I chose the because I saw that there were two things that I could, two directions I could go with that, and I chose the one that I thought would be nicer. It
Mm-hmm.
did not turn out to be nice, so we'll have to have a chat afterwards about
Yeah, I'd love to
how your
actually.
choices played out.
I
But
think they do something quite clever there. I think the horrible one looks like it's going to be the gentle one, and that's quite effective, and
mm,
vice versa. And I think that's quite effective horror storytelling. It's also fucking grim both ways, but and I appreciate it's probably annoying us being that vague about it, but it's worth avoiding spoiling it, I think. Like that, I just thought the sequence was great. I did have a slightly different read on it, which is, so I think one of its kind of lovely little motifs, particularly is I think it does use, so an element of Geiger's work that is very useful to it, I think, as a game, is the industrial side of things, right? Like that,
yeah.
that sort of discovery that you feel like you're in some sort of, you know, Freudian cock monolith, but what you're actually inside is a factory, and your task in that moment is to determine how to use that factory to make the thing that factory makes, like you're reverse engineering someone's Infinifactory build or something
Yeah.
like that. Just determining the right series of levers and buttons and operations to determine things. And they obviously, as we've suggested, derive some horror from surprising you with the consequences of some of those actions. But really, the horror comes from the fact that the nature of what you're doing, the organic nature of the environment that you're working with, and the organic nature of the pieces, every aspect of it is organic, tries to draw empathy from you, and the puzzle solving side of it plus the industrial side of it just draws process from you.
Mm.
And those two things, like I didn't find myself thinking, oh, my character is the bad guy or is the villain necessarily. I saw my character sees this as a factory.
Oh yeah, I don't mean that you're. When I say you're not a good person, I mean like you aren't moral. Like you aren't a
Mm,
creature that perceives the world in those terms. Like you are doing something which is in your interests, and that may involve pulping fetuses, and that's neither here nor there to your character. But I mean, as a
right.
player observing this and enacting it, you may have feelings about it.
Oh yeah, it's gross, but it's a horror game. Like I think for me, it's like it feels like quite a successful engagement with Geiger for that reason,
Oh
though,
yeah, for
because
sure. Yeah.
it's like this is the it's like it dares you to see flesh as amoral in the same way that machinery is amoral, right?
Mm.
And and it almost requires you to, because otherwise you would simply stop and quit. Like, yeah.
I would say though that even though that has, like you say, the factory aspect allows you to kind of interpret these environments in ways which can ring out puzzle like
Mm.
mechanics. Um, there's some weird red herrings in there which I just don't think are
Mm.
necessary because the environment is difficult to read in itself, and it like that's the initial sliding puzzle you referred to earlier. There's You're trying to get an egg from one side of this sort of like slidey tile thing to another. You have to choose which egg you want, and there's one which is red and glowing, and if you pick that one, it just bursts, and then you have to pick one
That's
which
more
is
inconvenient.
otherwise it's more inconvenient, but it's also not noticeable in the environment because it looks like all of the other eggs, except when you look at it very closely, some of the things which are otherwise lit as like specular highlights on them could be glowing instead on this one. But like, I would never have picked that one as the odd one out, as the one you should select, until like the obvious one that you should select was removed. And
Huh.
it took me a while to, I don't know if it's just my graphics settings as well, but there was nothing highlighting that egg
In
particularly.
in my experience of it, and I solved it today, the two you're referring to, are both glowing exactly the same way.
Oh, that's interesting. Maybe they patched it.
Yeah, maybe, because yeah, for me, it was like one of them is like easier, and it tells you this is what to look for, and the other one is the other one.
Oh, no, the two
Oh,
the two eggs
interesting.
that you can get in my playthrough of it were different looking. And the second egg, which you needed, looked like all of the other eggs that you can't even manipulate, um,
Mm. I
except that it had these two slight dots on the top, which were slightly brighter lit on that one than the others.
Yeah, both in my they were both had those two yellow lights on them.
Yeah.
That was my experience of it. I think sometimes it is like, for its polish, and it does have moments of like real kind of, the environments are incredible. I think there are some issues with like clarity of feedback, or like just sort of not getting interesting results out of negative outcomes.
Mm,
I think would make the world richer. Something that occurred to me is, I think it feels like it almost wants to be a VR game. I don't know
mm,
if it is available in that way. In the one of those sort of exploratory VR games, heavily about environment art, where your puzzles are a kind of way to get you engaged with the environment, but aren't themselves the point. I do think that first puzzle is pretty good when you get going with it after that slidey
oh
puzzle
yeah.
stuff. But like, I haven't made it much further than that, and I have tried to fight the urge to run to the next interactable thing, ignoring the environment, because that's not the point, right?
Mm.
But that temptation does kind of grow in a way that I find the VR is traditionally quite good at shaking out, or shaking you out of.
Yeah, I think so. I that is the puzzle that kind of most connected with me in the game. A lot of the other ones don't have quite the same emotional resonance as that one does,
Mm,
for better reasons in some ways. Um, a lot of them, you start to become kind of wise to the way in which the puzzles are presented to you. So you basically uh, y- uh, you referenced, was it Infinifactory you mentioned ago?
yeah,
Yeah, it's like nearly all of the puzzles from then are introduced to you by you finding the place where the end result of your Infinifactory conveyor belt would end up, and then walking back along the conveyor belts until you get to the first thing, and then
right.
and once you realize that that's the kind of the process, that it's sort of, you get a little bit impatient. You're like, okay, just show me the first thing first, motherfucker.
Right.
um, so that's so that sort of draws away a little of the fun of some of the later puzzles, and some of them are just bad. They're just bad puzzles in that they are extremely obscure in the sense that they don't have an internal logic, like that first puzzle does. And I think you can kind of excuse some of that obscurity successfully, um, by saying, "Look, these aren't designed puzzles in the world of Scorn. These are bizarre mechanisms of a society that has built entire palaces out of labia. They don't really need to make sense as such. You don't need to have rules, but your job is just to interpret them as you might a nightmare, and then sort of exploit them to your own ends. But then some of them just require you to do things which seem to be against all of the instructions that you've been given so far. And like there's one late in the game, I just had to look it up, and I can tell you there's absolutely no way I would have ever guessed that that's what I had to do, because everything that you've done up until that point has been literally the opposite of that. And to do the thing that you then have to do is something you could have done initially but weren't allowed to do. So the entire process up until that point has been kind of semiotically inert, null. It's a bizarre choice. I don't quite know how that got through.
Right.
It is pretty disgusting what you do. So I imagine that's why they kept it in, because it was just the act of doing it was the selling point. But I mean, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
There's some bits of it just feel very opaque in like a that fucking sucks way.
Yeah, I think the appeal of it is like, I'm engaging with an alien machine, the body, and I'm making it fart. Like that's the like, and do things and be a train or anything else the body might do. And then the reality of it is, I don't know what to do next because this is a computer game. And I think like I was quite pleased that I have played it as far as I have without looking anything up, because I'm normally quite impatient. Like really, I'm not after the satisfaction of doing it myself. I'm after the next thing. I want to see the things. I want to have the experiences. So I wouldn't be above just going through it with a guide just to see it. I probably won't, because I'm making decent progress. But
yeah, there are only a couple of instances where I had to look things up. Some of it, one of the other instance was because something in the environment was just, I knew it was there, but I knew it was going to be very difficult to find, just because of the nature of the environment was incredibly intricate and maze-like, and the thing I was looking for was very small. And it was very small, and I probably would have spent hours just walking round and round and round and round and round looking for it. Even though, intellectually I had solved what the puzzle required me to do. It had opened a passageway, basically, that I knew I was going to know where it was. And that just saved me from being very bored.
Yeah. I think there's... Yeah, go on, sorry.
Well, the other boring thing in it is the combat, which fucking sucks. And you can also, I guess, like the puzzles, say that there's a sort of diegetic intentionality to how much it fucking sucks, because you're in fucking Geiger world. Of course, it's going to feel grim and awful and desperate. And some things are good about it, like the guns are these very fun designs. They're all made of bones and intestines. And when you sort of reload, you sort of dislocate the frontage of this thing, and you press teeth one by one into this spinal column to load it. And the whole gun is actually the tail of this parasitic creature that has climbed onto you and partially disemboweled you. But like in a cute twist, if you refill your ammo, this you look down, and this thing that's got its hands warming in your entrails just sort of reaches out with his little hand and holds your ammo pouch for you in this little flesh donut, which is cute. You don't have the best of relationships with it, but it's complicated. But the combat itself is just so sludgy, and ammunition is so ineffective and also sparse that it makes you conservative in a way which I found was boring and methodical enough to distance me from the actual atmosphere of the game. You can often just wait for enemies to fuck off. They crawl back into the environment. The enemies are kind of terrible to fight, but they're kind of cool designs. Like they have this interesting life cycle between the different kinds of creatures that you can witness in the environment. And the main one you fight is a big dog made out of foreskin. So what's not to like. But yeah, fighting them is very frustrating. They don't have a particularly interesting manner of attacking you, and shooting them to death is just bullet spongy, and just slows you down in the interaction that you want to make in those environments. And sometimes those things are in direct contravention. Like sometimes you can be doing a puzzle and a bunch of enemies just turn up and they can't kill you while you're doing the puzzle. But as soon as you disengage doing the puzzle, then they all hit you at the same time and murder you, which is rubbish. And death can set you back a long way too. Like many steps of an elaborate time-consuming puzzle you are midway through executing, for example. That is what I call a bad choice.
Mm.
But yeah, but overall, like, I don't care. Like, I was buoyed along by the whole horrible vision and purpose of the game, that the irritation of actually playing it was somewhat mitigated, I thought. 6 out of 10. Classic. I don't know. I'm really interested to see what you think about the rest of the game as it progresses, because there's it is all very Geiger, but it does get into kind of celestial horror stuff, which is much more your bag as a Lovecraft fan as well towards the end. But,
I think I appreciate both. I enjoy a fleshy bag and the space bag, the two bags. As most cosmic horror does, goes from squelchy to celestial, as we all must. I think that's NASA's slogan.
As Oscar Wilde said, we all live in the gutter, but some of us look to the stars. I don't think that's what he was referencing, but let's pretend he was.
Mauled to death by a dog made of foreskins. Oh, good. Well, speaking of being, there's a good segue here to from being mauled to death by a dog made of foreskins to being mauled to death by a dog made of foreskins. If you'd like to undertake it with me,
let's go.
I for a chunk of the weekend played the beta test of Warhammer 40,000 Darktide. Fat Shark's long-awaited or much anticipated Vermintide, but 40k game. And
I'm jealous. I really wanted to get into that.
Yeah, actually, a friend of Pod, Paul Canavan, alerted me that you could just click a button on Steam to attempt to get a key, and I did. It was great. So I'm going to caveat this by saying, I have played all of both Vermintide games once, but I did not play them to death, which is, I think, because there's two sides of that. Those games I thought were great, very fun, Warhammer Fantasy themed, more advanced Left 4 Dead likes. I don't know what exactly the genre is, right? A to B zombie sprinters. What the fuck is that genre? Left 4 Dead. Left 4 Dead. That game. But obviously with sort of deeper character customization and loot and RPG style mechanics and things. I understand that people who are really into Vermintide particularly put thousands and thousands of hours and treated it more like a service game, like a kind of, an MMO or something like that. That's not my experience of it. And so I'll spring two things out of that. One, I was surprised that Darktide is way more of an MMO than I thought it was, which is interesting in terms of several decisions that they made. The other is I'll kind of skip to the end in the sense that I had a good time at first. I played a little bit more of it. I was excited by it. And then as soon as I realized I had to go out, so I played it for the last time and I knew that the beta would be over before I got home. And I just had that kind of I just pre-ordered it then and there. I'm now really excited by it. And actually, as somebody who hasn't really clicked with a new game for a while, let alone wanted to invite a big time sinky sort of thing into my life, it's rare that I'm I'm pre-ordering this now. I can't wait to play this again. So that's a big positive. And then sort of a bit kind of buoyed by enthusiasm for it, I thought, I must check what people are saying, because the it feels like a bit of a surprise. I'm not surprised that it's good, but I was taken with I really like this, and I will speak to why. I went on the Reddit, and obviously that's always a bad idea, but the Reddit is, as far as I could tell, wholly made up of people who've played 5,000 hours of Vermintide and then played 30-40 hours of this in 2 days, saying it's garbage. So I don't know how true that is. A lot of it was pointing to sort of power player quality of life features that seem to be missing. I saw a lot of fairly egregiously wrong takes about how accurate to a final game beta tests tend to be. Obviously, these builds will have been branched a while ago, so you don't really know. But I did want to caveat it in that way, where it's like I don't feel like I can give the definitive opinion as a Vermintide fan, and the Vermintide fans that I saw seemed all to be furious for some reason. But I had a great time with it. And there's lots of things I'd kind of like to kind of approach it from. But the first is, it does feel more like, when I say more like an MMO, I mean in terms of like foregrounding progression and this game as something that you'll kind of invest time in than, at least for me, the Vermintide games did. Walking it a few steps further along from Vermintide or Left 4 Dead towards really Phantasy Star or original Guild Wars, that kind of like mission run based game with a centralized hub where you return to level up your character, basically. The other thing that I didn't realize they were doing, because again, maybe it's just that I'm not consuming tons of games media, but I genuinely didn't know this, is that it doesn't instead of like fixed characters, it has classes. So there's actual character creation and stuff. And so the premise of the game, obviously it's set in Warhammer, in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and the premise of the game is that your characters are sort of they're referred to, the kind of like marketing word for it is rejects, but they're basically people who've been incarcerated by the Imperium on a big prison ship and are now being carted to the surface of a cult uprising on a hive world, like a big industrial hive world, to do shitty jobs that the Imperium wouldn't otherwise get around to doing, basically. So you're a bunch of gangly, awful shits from the bottom of either Imperial Society or the Astra Militarum or the Imperial Guard, regular kind of humans or ogrins, which are the kind of space ogres, kind of just doing your thing. And when you create your character, it's quite involved. There are 4 classes initially, which are basically the sort of sharpshooters, like a kind of Astra Militarum soldier on with a lasgun, a sort of half-sanctioned / unsanctioned psyker, which I'll speak to a little bit, a zealot, like a kind of, devotee of the God Emperor, who's maybe gone a bit too far, and the Ogren Brute, who is a big boy who can push. But yeah, you make a character, and all of them except the Ogren can be male or female, and there's character customization where you can make just the ugliest people, but in a very quite guided way, I think. My only complaint is that the tattoos aren't very good, in that they don't feel very much like Warhammer. One of them's just like a lion. You're like, where the fuck did you see a lion? Like, anyway, sorry, I need a sip of water so I can gush even more. And so you make a character, and then there's like quite a kind of or like elaborate personality sort of test, or like background construction system. Like, what did you do in your childhood? What did you do? What was the, how did you end up in the situation you're in now? What was your crime? And that affects what color prison garb you're wearing at the start. And it uses, and having done all of this, it lets you pick from a kind of little range of personalities. And that's what determines your voice. Because obviously in Vermintide, they had lots of really characterful voice acting, but they were also fixed characters who talked to each other. A bit like Left 4 Dead, where the characters would have dialogue with each other. And this is like probably the most superficial system to get excited about first. But they've done a really nice job. And I can see how they've done it, because it's sort of, these things it's just big spreadsheets full of lines. But at the top, when it's time for the characters to speak to one another, it will sort of construct a conversation out of the recorded lines based on the personalities of the people in the party at the time. And so, there's a famous 40k planet called Cadia that blew up in the miniature setting a few years ago, and that is reflected in the backstory of the game. And a character might say, like, this one's for Cadia, and someone else might just respond to them. And there's something quite fun about feeling characters that you feel like you made interact with each other in that way, and it does bring the world to life in quite a nice way. It's not the deepest system in the world, but I genuinely quite liked it. I thought it was good. Also, I had a really uncanny thing of like self-indulgently, I named my first character after a character I wrote in a story for Black Library, because I write for Black Library now. and that story is out. And then I realized that the guy who briefs you in the game has exactly the same name, because when he
Oh,
started showing up in the subtitles, it was the same name. And the story, I think, was written by Dan Abnett, who's a very prolific Black Library author and a very good one. And so it's kind of weird, this sort of like confluence of like two men whom have named Warhammer people, name Warhammer people the same name. And then, so sort of asynchronously staring at Dan Abnett over the gulf of obviously, extremely differently weighted contributions to that setting, but nonetheless. And so that was something I really liked, how it kind of immersed me in it. And then you're kind of in this you're in the big hub ship, and it looks great, big gothic fuck off map, and you can go visit the navigator and stuff like that. And then otherwise you are doing missions, and the missions are, as you would expect, sort of the same, the familiar sort of explore, clear enemies, find ammo, perform objectives that often require you to move something heavy or wait for a lift, and fight off hordes of cultists, special characters, dogs that pin you down, explodey pox men, people with toxic flamethrowers, like all of the hits in some ways, and that stuff's quite familiar.
Is it all Nurgle all the time?
It's not. It's a mixture of Nurgle and sort of regular Chaos cultists. It's interesting that the sort of the poxwalkers, which are basically Nurgle zombies, are more or less the same as the regular Chaos cultists, because like one of them is like, shabby plague men who will run at you and swipe at you. The other is just sort of like an assortment of industrial workers who wear the wrong hat and now are trying to kill you with a pipe. And it's sort of the same experience, but there's also traitor guard, so like chaos corrupted Astra Militarum soldiers, and they are very different to fight because they're a ranged threat fundamentally. And crucially, it changes what they'll be doing. So if you enter an environment that has loads of them in it, they'll just be on patrol or guarding things or walking around fairly intelligently, and then you bust in and start shooting people. Where it shines for me, and where I'm genuinely quite impressed by it, is, well, I'll say one more superficial thing, and then I'll say a thing of meaning, and then I'll say another superficial thing. It looks great. Environments look really lovely. The visual effects are great. The audio's great. They've done a very good job of bringing the kind of weapons of 40k to life in a way that they've 40k has such absurd escalation in the power of its guns that it's things like las guns are supposed to be powerful, but in the they only ever simulate them as kind of quite piddly, and in this they feel great, and that's really cool. It feels way more tactile and satisfying than the most recent Necromunda game did, with a lot of the same pieces, I will say. But here's the thing I wanted to really dig into. I think they have come up with a really cool, pretty satisfying set of both fundamental combat mechanics and abilities to layer on top of that. And I still trust them with this after Vermintide, but Vermintide's primarily a melee game. It's one of the reasons it worked quite well. And it's really interesting to return to a ranged combat style Left 4 Dead game, which obviously Left 4 Dead is as well, right? In a way that feels really fresh. And the reasons for this are kind of quite straightforward in a way. One is like the melee system is good, like the kind of combination of light attacks, heavy attacks, blocks, pushes, follow-ups, and so on. Like it's deep enough that you can achieve things with skill, and it's not so deep that it's bewildering. And as I say, the range combat feels really good, and things like grenades are well implemented, and the pacing of it feels really good. What I really like about it is there's some pretty good, fairly gamey, like sandbox design, like combat sandbox design, in terms of encouraging interesting problem solving. So if you and I think this will hopefully tickle the FPS designer / enthusiast in you, Marsh. Like there's basic mechanic. If a enemy is shooting at you, you can become pinned down, and if you're pinned down, you can't shoot for shit, but it's quite clear from a visual effect.
Oh,
And
okay.
ranged damage does quite a lot of damage to you. So getting shot at is bad, taking cover is good, right? Those sorts of things are kind of, it feels a bit like Gears of War in that way, right? Like you want to think about how to take cover, particularly if your position's being pushed by a mixture of ranged and melee enemies. However, you have like dodge, sprint, and slide. While you're sprinting, you're much less likely to be pinned down or hit. Like there's definitely like a modifier that's applied to it, and above and beyond simply the fact that you're moving faster, which means that sprinting between cover is like a viable thing that gets you closer to your enemy. And then there's a hard and fast rule, which is that if you close with an enemy and whip out your melee weapon, which in like for the marksman class it's like a spade, like whatever the fuck you've got on you at the time.
A spade?
Yeah, spades
Doesn't
are quite
feel
big.
very spacey.
Spades are quite a big thing for 40k for some reason.
Okay.
For certain parts of the Astra Militarum anyway. If you do this, the enemy will also pull out a melee weapon to defend themselves. And so that means that closing with the enemy shuts down their ability to pin down your other teammates, which is a really cool bit of it's both a really cool bit of co-op design, because it's like if someone's a bit in a bit of a shit situation, going in for melee is a good way to bail them out, right? It's a viable strategy, and it helps kind of maintain that like sort of rock paper scissors between approaches. Kind of gives you a way to close it with the enemy and sort of bail your friends out. The other side of it that I really like is it really feels like a miniatures game in those moments, because things like, I'm thinking specifically of things like Kill Team, where like, which is the sort of smaller scale kind of miniatures combat, skirmish combat, where like, concepts that are really familiar to wargamers, like tying an enemy up in melee so they can't shoot, is like Warhammer 101 in some ways. And so having that represented in the game is both like, I think, good co-op design, in it kind of rewards players for both approaches, and also just feels like Warhammer, which is such a cool win for them. And then there's other things like you have.
Can I just Can I just ask? Is that symmetric? So like, can you also suppress the enemy with fire?
I believe so, but they die quite quick. So if you're actually if you're shooting accurately, you're probably killing them.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So that is the other way of suppressing them. Like, it's more like, it's like you're quite lethal and you do tear through hordes of enemies. So it's more like you don't really suppress them. It's just like if you are suppressed, your lethality drops and you need to fix it, basically.
Yeah. Sorry, carry on.
No, good question. Like, it was, it's sort of, because I had to think about it as well. Like, could you suppress them? And it's like, I think every time I've tried to suppress them, I've just shot them in the head. And so that's really cool. And then there's other sort of decisions. So you have a health bar that doesn't regenerate, and that means you have to go find med packs or Medicae stations or whatever to kind of repair it. But you do have like basically a shield bar. I can't remember what I think it's called stamina. No, it's not stamina. That's for sprinting. It's got like it's toughness. I think it's like a resilience bar on top of your health bar, that you regenerate by either being near your teammates or killing things in melee. So that's the other reason to switch to melee, is like, particularly if you're being hoarded by chaff, you can actually kind of keep your health topped up by sort of dispatching hordes of them with your spade or whatever.
Wow, that's such a kind of big and not terribly subtle way of chaperoning the players into good cooperative play, which also conserves your ammunition as a group.
Yeah, right. It's not subtle.
No, but I think I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, because it then feels good to cooperate, right? Like it feels good to kind of be in that position. Yeah, I think it's really cool. And then like the abilities are that I've played with, at least, and I've only played 2 of the classes, or only had a chance to play 2 of the classes in the beta. I think it's quite fun to kind of explore what they mean for that kind of co-op pattern. Like as the sharpshooter character has the las gun, I found myself mostly trying to hold back, and like, because you have slightly better ranged weapon, your weapon has greater range and power generally than the default ranged weapons. You can when you complete missions, you get loot, and that loot includes new and better versions of the same guns with different stats and things like that. And then I think over time, different guns, like for each class. Like, and certainly the trailers and stuff show them using very different weapons from the setting. I think in the beta it was kind of limited. But basically, you're the character with the best range weapon, so you're kind of holding back and trying to like thin crowds before they can get to your friends and so on. But their kind of main ability is like this sort of sharpshooter mode where you gain extra damage, I think, and also special enemies, so like sort of elite characters and so on, are highlighted for you in crowds so you can pick them off. And I think the reason one of the things they've done really successfully is that those key abilities don't feel like ultimates. They're quite a short cooldown. So it's sort of, in addition to the basic mechanics of like shoot a bit, melee a bit, try and not to get pinned, try not to take any damage so you don't have to heal, you're threading in these kind of class-specific abilities that give you a bit of a clearer role. And I really liked that. I think it feels good. But I didn't really like have the kind of like, oh shit, I love this, until I played as the Psyker. Psykers being psychics of the 40k universe, and fairly self-destructive and prone to getting in trouble. And at least as far as I played it in the beta, the psychic powers don't feel like spells, and I really appreciate that they did that. Like there's a mechanic by which they can potentially like effectively overheat or incur something called Perils of the Warp, which feels quite similar to the Bright Wizard, the Fire Mage from Vermintide, potentially, but you don't feel like a wizard because you're not casting spells in that way. The way the psychic stuff works is if you concentrate very, very hard on one enemy, you will make its head explode. That's what you will do. But you have to kind of like channel it, and the more you channel it, and if you try and channel it in advance, you're just building up this surge of Perils of the Warp. And the more the bar increases, your kind of screen closes in, and there'll be like tentacle kind of effects at the periphery of your vision as you know, you kind of run the risk of sort of slipping into the immaterium and getting chaosified. And so and then your cooldown ability is like a kind of force push kind of shockwave that pushes enemies back and completely drains your Perils of the Warp bar. So you're kind of like, you also have a gun and a knife, but like you're kind of building it up and then letting it go, and then building it up and then letting it go, and trying to time things.
You max out? I mean, presumably you don't literally get overtaken by a chaos god.
I didn't do it. I think you just take a ton of damage. You may even just be downed.
Right.
I didn't actually see. I think it's self damage based on what I think I saw happen to another player actually. But the big limitation of it is it's pretty powerful, but you can only channel it on one being at a time. And at least in the beta, there's no like upgrading it to affect multiple characters. But where it becomes really powerful is anyone who's in the process of having like a weaselly little psyker concentrate on them really hard starts to like stagger and slow down, which will like pull them out of a group or whatever. And then if you channel it enough, their head explodes. It doesn't work on like bosses, like the big boss characters necessarily, but it does work on pretty much everything else. And like there's like a genuine like satisfaction in like being charged by a big horde, and there's like loads of chaff running at you, and everyone's kind of hacking or shooting their way through the chaff, and you can see the big fuck off cultist guy with a chain axe running at you from the back, and you just start concentrating on him, and then by the time he gets close enough to hurt anybody, his head blows up. And it feels fucking great.
That's really
like,
cool.
Yeah. Or like got very excited because there are these like chaos hounds, like corrupted dogs, basically bring us back to the full circle, that leap on people and pin them down. And I managed to kind of snare one just as it was about to leap on a friend and just blow up its head. And I think I yelled, "Yes, I am the dog popper." Just, and I was having a great time. So yeah, really taken with it. I think I don't know, like it's got a lot of like post-mission currencies and loot that I didn't really get to kick the tires of in the beta, and I don't know how tiresome that could potentially become. Like, I don't know if it's a game I'm necessarily playing to get like a slightly better lasgun with a shorter stock, you know? So that's a bit of a, you know, question mark, and I do get the impression that a lot of the complaints from really hardcore Vermintide players was about features that they expect as people who for whom this game is about build crafting and perfection and scores and really acing it. But I had a really good time with just the amount that was there. The final thing I wanted to say, to return to something, well, it's not superficial, it's really important, is the soundtrack is far better than it has any fucking right to be. Holy shit. Like, when it kicks off, you're in, like, you go from being in, like, I'm in a big, voluminous, echoey, cathedral, factory, Warhammer goth place, to being like, I'm in a big, voluminous, cathedral, gothy, goth club, basically. Like, it's somewhere between, like, sort of darkwave, goth, Castlevania metal, and it fucking slaps. Genuinely, I looked on Steam to see if they sold a special edition, like, with the OST, and I never do that or care.
Oh, well, I've done that with other Warhammer properties. The Mechanicus game
Yeah,
had an
right.
absolute fucking bombing soundtrack. I loved it. I often listen to it.
That's a good point. Actually, I did love the Mechanicum soundtrack. But
I
yeah,
wonder
apparently,
I wonder who does the soundtrack for Darktide.
I think it's Jesper Kidd.
Oh, a big name, eh?
Yeah. But he's fucking done it. He has. Like, it's like when it kicked in during a boss fight, like, I genuinely had the, like, why is this going so hard? Holy shit. It was genuinely very exciting. Yeah, I'm very excited to, like, I really hope it's a success, and I suspect it will be given the hype. Partly because I would just love to see it expand out to more of that universe. It feels like a very, very fertile, grotesque, sticky little bed of oily, rivety, industrial gothic horror to grow some more factions from, maybe.
Oh yeah.
That would be great. But yeah, no, I mean, it's lovely to see it kind of, because Vermintide's great, obviously, but, like, see them continue their tear, basically. Good for Fat Shark.
Oh, I'm excited. Yeah. So, I mean, I know you haven't played with that a huge amount, but do you get the sense that the other characters you can play have the same sort of delightful eccentricity as playing the Psyker?
I think I like the Psyker partly because of the head popping, and partly because I just fucking love one of the voice actors, whose direction for this was, you're the only man having a nice time in the 41st millennium. Because he just sort of was like, hello, it's dark in here, isn't it? Oh shit. And then, like, it's sort of, everyone else is sort of very grim. Good accents, actually, I will say as well. Like, I think if you're from Cadia, you are also canonically from Birmingham.
Really?
But Birmingham is also a planet in Warhammer 40,000.
Tom will be pleased.
So, well, Birmingham.
Well, hang on, Birmingham is a planet
In 40k, yeah.
Okay.
Well, a lot of world building was done in the 90s.
Does it have a impressive ring road?
It does, yeah. Yeah. But good accents. But yeah, I think I didn't play the other two, so I can't judge them. But, like, I did enjoy the two I played, and, like, I would happily go back and play the lasgun person again. It wasn't that I was, like, all in on Psycho. I think I could imagine myself matching them to missions and stuff as well. I think the Zealot is the best in melee, is their thing, and they have some ways to power that up, and they can have, like, thunder hammers and stuff, which sounds fun. And then the Ogryn is much bigger than everyone else and can, like, shoulder barge enemies out of the way. And, like, I think any task that involves carrying something, like a big cooling rod or a box, they're better at. So there's some sort of, like, balancing things there. But I didn't play them, so I can't comment on them. I just like the dog popper.
Oh gosh, do you know how long the beta is running for? Can I still get into it, or should I just wait for it? It's over. Okay.
It was over just over the last weekend. So,
and the actual game is out in November, right?
End of November, yeah.
Well. A
little winter treat. Yeah, I enjoyed it very much. And I'm very excited to see what the final game's like. So yeah, it's genuinely really nice to just be, like, now kind of like, oh, quite pumped for that to come out now, and got it on pre-order, and yeah.
Oh, sweet. Oh,
lovely.
Yeah, I look forward to that. Good stuff. Good dog popping.
Good
all round.
Yeah.
Well, actually, exactly. Pretty bad dog popping in Scorn, but
those dogs notably unpopped. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means, and we should stop. before I go any deeper into my notes. Is that all of the goopy, sticky, sort of slightly rectal environments we have to talk about this evening?
I would like to give one last credit to Scorn. There's a
Hmm.
point in the game where you're wrong-footed and you end up being encased in gunk,
Hmm.
and when you break out of the gunk, um, it's a really good animation. It looks like you're sort of like you've been encased in brandy snaps, except that it's not brandy, Chris. It's spunk. uh, but the way it kind of snaps off you looks really good.
Nice.
So yeah,
Oh,
maybe it's a
wow.
7 out of 10 after all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you could do one of those classic like IGM pluses and minus boxes, right? Like didn't like the gunplay. Great dry spunk though. I'm sorry, listeners. I'm sorry we missed a week and now we're back and it's just this. But
I've been
blame
in
games.
the reason I mean, Mr. Week, because I was embracing my own body horror, with a bout of very severe illness.
Oh dear. Well,
So
you sound much better, so I'm glad that that's the case, and I'm glad that you've managed to spend this time just enjoying the squelchy fartiness of a different dimension.
indeed.
Great. The dimension inside the computer they call games. Good. I need to stop talking. It's been a day of it, and if it's allowed to continue, it's only going to get worse. So that's all we have time for this week. If you, what do we normally say? If you'd like to find more podcasts like this one, you can find us at crateandcrowbar.com. You can find this episode and others like it on YouTube at youtube.com/crateandcrowbar. Thank you very much, as ever, to everyone who backs us on Patreon. More information about contributing to the pod, and thank you to everybody that does, can be found at patreon.com/crateandcrowbar. Otherwise, I've been Chris Thurston.
I've been Marsh Davis.
Thanks for listening, everybody.